Good morning. My name is Priscilla Southwell. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Oregon, and I will soon switch to my PowerPoint presentation, but I would like to begin a conversation with you about controversies in US elections, which certainly have arisen as a flashpoint in the 2020 elections, but some of the controversies that I will discuss have actually been around for a long time. So now I would like to switch to the PowerPoint and highlight some of the controversies. I clearly can't in 20 minutes deal with all of them, and some of you will, in subsequent questioning, bring up other things that I maybe can address. All right, I am sharing the screen, and this is a PowerPoint, not surprisingly. And sorry, I have to do a couple of, so as I've said, I am Priscilla Southwell, and what I'm going to do is deal with controversies, a selected few of them. And as you can imagine, one of the first ones, the one that has gotten the most media attention, and rightfully so, is the Electoral College, a very unique institution, for better or for worse, that has been around since the beginning, since the second Constitution in 1787, that basically is an indirect way of choosing a president. And without going into a great deal of electoral history, I do want to explain in essence what the founding fathers, the people who created our second Constitution, the current Constitution, had in mind. To be very blunt, they were elitist. They were very concerned about the power of the masses. They were concerned about rabble rousers. I mean, they had just come out of the Shays' Rebellion, to give a bit of history, and they wanted to establish a constitution that had a certain buffer against the masses, as they would call them, or as I would call them, the people. So this is a method, and I will go into the mechanics of this. This is a method where the popular vote matters. It does matter in each state, each of the 50 states in the District of Columbia. But in essence, what it means is whoever wins the plurality, that is the greatest number of popular votes in a state, gets all of the electors. Now, you note on my PowerPoint that there are two exceptions. Maine and Nebraska do them somewhat proportionally. So they do think about congressional districts, that is US House districts, as well as the entire state. But they are rather low in population, so their amount of electors are not usually significant, but they actually, I have to say, are leaders in some type of variation on this theme. So what that means is that anyone who comes out on top, that's the plurality, in a state, say, for example, like California, with 54 electoral votes, even if that presidential candidate wins by 1,000 votes, he or she gets all of California's 54 electoral votes. And that's the factor that has caused a certain amount of problem over the years, certainly did so in 2016. And I'll talk more about that election. So you look at the popular vote, which determines the electoral vote, winner take all, you get all of them. And then what a presidential candidate needs to do to be declared elected is he or she has to get basically a majority plus one, or 270 out of 538 votes. Now, I guess I should sort of explain how the electoral votes are allocated to states. It's basically the number of House seats that you have. So that's determined by population plus 2. So that explains why Oregon, where I live, where I teach, has 5 US House seats, and therefore they have 7 electoral votes. All right, the next controversy is if there is no majority, that is, if no presidential candidate gets the required majority of the electoral votes of obviously varied across the years, depending on how many states were in the Union. But if there is no majority, and I think this is probably the strangest thing about the Electoral College, then the election is thrown into the House, as we call it in the United States. It's basically given to the House of Representatives for the presidential situation, and for the Senate, it's for the vice president. So that's kind of strange. You could theoretically have a situation where the House would decide on a Democratic president and the Senate could decide on a Republican vice president, but anyway, it's strange. But the most peculiar aspect about this is that when it is thrown, let's just talk about the presidential race, when it is thrown into the House of Representatives, each state gets one vote. And that's probably the most undemocratic element about the Electoral College. Granted, it has only happened twice in American history, but even this year, people were quite concerned about it. So that would mean if it had happened in 2020, which thank Kevin, it didn't, California would get one vote. Its House delegation would, 52 members would get, they'd have to get together and caucus, and they would only have one vote, or 1/50 of the presidential vote. And Oregon, with population that is about 1/20th the size of California, would also get one vote. So you can see why people get upset about it. All right, so these are the undemocratic elements, and I've already started to allude to them. Probably the most egregious one, the one that gets the most attention, is the first bullet point, which is when the candidate, the presidential candidate who gets the greatest number of popular votes is not chosen, either because of the Electoral College or because it was thrown into the House. And you can see my second point in terms of 1800 and 1824. Actually, in 1800, the popular vote winner was chosen, but nonetheless, it causes a great deal of consternation. And certainly, if you look at the most recent years, in both 2000 and 2016, that has happened. And that's the kind of undemocratic element that makes a lot of people want to reform or reject the Electoral College. There are all kinds of other things that I can add. It certainly is, if it's thrown into the House and you have California getting one vote and Oregon getting one vote, Wyoming getting one vote, it does violate a principle that has been established by our U.S. Supreme Court of one person, one vote, because clearly California voters matter much, much less than smaller states like Oregon or Wyoming. It is definitely a disadvantage to third parties. We don't have too many of them, not viable ones in the United States. But when you compare it to other countries in Asia and Europe and Latin America that have viable third parties and have a possible chance of having their candidate become prime minister or president, that's just simply not going to happen in the United States because of the Electoral College. Faithless electors is something that's come up more recently, but electors are simply people that come from each state, and they usually go to their state capital on December 14th of this year and cast their ballot. There have been occasions, and happened in 2016, just a handful of them, people who have just ignored the popular vote in their state. I think that's less of an issue, but it still is a concern there. A lot of people have argued that one of the undemocratic or the undesirable elements of the Electoral College is that if you're not living in a swing state, if you live in California or Oregon or Washington, I'm just going to do the West Coast, where it was clear on every poll that presidential candidate Biden was way ahead. Some people will say, if you only care about the presidential race, why vote? But of course, if you lived in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Michigan, you would have a greater incentive to do that. And that relates to my next point, is that candidates, presidential candidates, are strategic and they have limited resources, and they will not come to Oregon or California or Washington, at least not in 2020. And where did they go? They went to the swing states. They went to Florida. They went to North Carolina. They went to Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So lots going on there. You can just see what the issue was in terms of, this is just a graphic about 2016. So you can see that these are just the states, and you can see that this is a divided country. And I don't have the final official results for 2020, but they're not that much different. The ones that flipped, so to speak, and made the difference in the 2020 election are the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. So it was very close in both elections, but at least in 2020, the popular vote and the electoral vote were hand in hand. That doesn't happen, and it certainly didn't happen in 2016. All right, so you can see what I'm saying here is that this is again, it's still controversial, but these are the official figures that Hillary Clinton, the Democratic presidential candidate, got a greater percentage of the popular vote than did Donald Trump. But because he prevailed in the Electoral College, he was the official winner. All right, this is the other controversial one, but this is a little different, and I will explain that in more detail later. This was having to do with disputed votes in Florida. And you can see ultimately that 25 electoral votes went to George Bush, which gave him the victory in 2020. So it's a bit of a different story than what happened in 2016 or even what happened in 2020. And I'll get to that in a minute. All right, so these are the controversial elections having to do mainly due to the Electoral College. So again, these are the two where there was no one. This is a bit of history here, maybe a little more excess of history. These are where there was no winner in the Electoral College. In other words, no candidate got the necessary 50% plus one. And so it was thrown into the House of Representatives. And in the end, Thomas Jefferson won over Aaron Burr. And Thomas Jefferson had gotten more popular votes. So it maybe didn't make people so unhappy. In 1824, that did not happen. And you can see that Adams won over Jackson, even though Jackson had gotten more popular votes. All right, so this is sort of it in a nutshell. So you have to, the 1824 election, the reason why this popular vote and electoral vote parted company is because it was thrown into the House. The other four elections, two of which happened in the 1800s, but the one more recently, are because of what this winner-take-all provision that I talked about. If you win in a state, you win the popular vote, even by a very small margin, you win all of those electoral votes. So if a candidate, let's just speak with the more recent examples, Al Gore lost in a few states just by a small margin. Same thing with Hillary Clinton. So in essence, they sometimes refer to them as wasted votes in those states where they lost narrowly, do add to their popular vote total, but they certainly don't help them on the Electoral College. And that's the at least mathematical explanation for why the Electoral College and the popular vote can part company. And clearly these four elections, the lower four, were controversial at the time and continue to be. All right, so what next? What do we do? If we want to abolish the Electoral College, which frankly, I think that would be a great idea because it's very undemocratic. You could imagine if any other country in the world conducted elections and they said, oh, well, the popular vote winner didn't get chosen as the president or the prime minister or whatever, that we'd probably, the US in all of its hubris would probably send in election observers. Anyway, so if we wanted to abolish the abolish the Electoral College, we could have a constitutional amendment because it is embedded in our Constitution. Very difficult to get a constitutional amendment. It takes many, many years of pressure, etc. If you were going to do it in terms of getting support across the nation, it would take a long time. If we were going to look to Congress to do that, I doubt that that's a safe route, because many individuals especially from smaller states, sort of like their advantage in the Electoral College. It's true of their advantage in the US Senate as well, where no matter what your population is, you get 2 senators. So I'm not exactly optimistic that that will happen in the next decade or so, but who knows? More states could be like Maine and Nebraska and have some proportionality. That would, again, be a kind of a states' right thing. It would be a more decentralized. It's a possibility. People have been talking about it. What most people have been talking about is the national popular vote. And it's a compact. It's an agreement among states, and more of them have signed on to it. Oregon has, which is whatever the popular vote is in your own state, the electors from your state will go to the presidential candidate that got the greatest number of popular votes. So that's kind of a courageous thing. So even if your state went for the Democrat, but the Republican candidate won the popular vote nationwide, then your electoral votes would go to that Republican popular vote winner. So it doesn't go into effect until enough states, and it hasn't reached that point, have agreed to it, that would reach that magical 270 figure. That's ways away, but the activists who are very much involved in this movement are very, very encouraged by the results. So now let me move on to something else besides the Electoral College, which is always the elephant in the room. So let's just talk about voting in elections in terms of this year and previous years. So the very encouraging point about the 2020 election is that voter turnout was the highest that it was in almost 120 years. So it depends on, whether it's since 1900 or 1904, but it was, hovering up there just under 70%, 68.8. So that's actually quite amazing. It's not surprising. A lot of it had to do with the perceived closeness of the election. Also had to do with the fact that the vote by mail, which is allowing people to have no excuse absentee voting, or actually universal vote by mail, as we do in Portland, or as we do in Eugene and Portland and all of Oregon, and allows people, it makes it a lot easier to vote. So that's probably the two main reasons. Voter suppression was a problem in 2020. This is kind of the downside of all of this. It is where steps are taken to prevent the voter from actually voting. The most obvious cases are in states that allowed vote by mail, not having enough drop-off sites. Texas allowed one for every county, no matter how populous the county was. Not having enough polling places, so people have to wait in line for 4, 5, 6 hours. All kinds of issues having to do with some people describe it as ensuring voter integrity, but ID requirements, all of those things, suppression of people, former felons who do have the right to vote, say in most states. And in Florida, I was actually a ballot initiative that allowed them to do so. And then the state legislature decided, no, you can't do that unless you pay your fines, your outstanding fines. So all kinds of things can happen. It still happened in 2020. It's really something we as a country have to deal with. Voter fraud has been the big thing that's been spread all over the media and still continues to do, as the lawsuits by the Republican Party and the Trump campaign continue to do. Oregon has used, they particularly address this charge of voter fraud against mail-in votes. Oregon has used vote by mail or mail-in voting for 20 years. We have very few cases of documented or proven instances of voter fraud. And the link here that I provided is from a conservative Heritage Foundation, who has, thankfully, a 20-year database of proven instances of voter fraud. So over that 20 years, we have scarcely over 1,000 of them. And they were prosecuted by all different kinds of reasons, heavy fines, civil penalties, etc. But look at it. It's a total of, over those 20 years, one case per year per state. Not going to change an election result, even for a small city council election. And I do urge you to look at the newspaper reports of even the outgoing Attorney General, William Barr, saying that his investigation of voter fraud has, and he concludes that there's not enough to have affected the election. So it may take a long time before this myth, and I don't use that term lightly, of voter fraud is dismissed. All right, so I have talked about vote by mail. It is obviously something that has been around for a long time in certain Western states. but it was adopted as a temporary reform given the COVID-19 virus. And so therefore, it may catch on in lots of other states. They may turn out looking like Oregon. As I said, it certainly had a lot to do with the increased voter turnout. Social media, misinformation, which I include within that, the whole notion of voter fraud. It is difficult, and it leads to my next point about inciting violence. If indeed people believe that the election was stolen, if indeed they think there is widespread fraud, they can protest, which is their right. But what's happening in the state of Georgia is very disturbing to many people because they have two upcoming Senate races that they have to decide due to the runoff rules in that state. And there's been a great deal of consternation about the fact that this notion of using social media to feed the more violent tendencies among disgruntled Americans is very disturbing. I was asked about this question about refusal to concede. That is a very unusual decision, and I think it is unique, and I hope it remains unique to the 2020 election. Most presidential candidates and their speechwriters have both a concession speech and an acceptance speech prepared, and they are very willing to give the concession speech. So it's unique, I hope. All right, so let's just talk a little bit more in the remaining minutes. I think the election was quite secure. Obviously, any kind of election, whether it's conducted entirely at the polling place or has a massive amount of vote by mail, has a potential for some kind of voter fraud, et cetera. And that's why you have protections. That's why you are very vigilant if you're an election official to make sure that the signature on a vote by mail ballot, not on the ballot itself, but on the mailing envelope, matches that signature when the person originally registered to vote. So voter suppression, this is actually I think the more unsavory aspect of the 2020 election that is unprecedented. As I said, a majority of Americans, over 75% of them, have the right to vote by mail. So when I was talking about voter suppression before, that's suppressing people who might want to vote. This is vote suppression, which is even when people vote, sometimes their ballot's not counted. And I will zero in on the state of Pennsylvania because that's actually been the source of many of these lawsuits, and they have to do with voter suppression. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in September ruled that naked ballots, and this is new vocabulary to me as well as you, naked ballots could not be counted. So in a vote by mail election, you have a ballot and then you put it into a secrecy envelope and then you put it into a mailing envelope. If a voter inadvertently or on purpose did not use that secrecy envelope, those are called naked ballots, and they were not counted in Pennsylvania as a result of this state Supreme Court ruling in September, even though they were counted during the state's primary earlier in the year. Very confusing to voters. All right, so let's say, and a lot of people did make that mistake. They forgot to put their ballot in a security envelope before they put it in the mailing envelope. So the Secretary of State, a Democrat of Pennsylvania, sent out a notice to all counties in Pennsylvania saying, if you notice this, if you see that people have done something wrong, whether they've forgotten the security envelope or their signature doesn't match, or they forgot to sign the mailing envelope, you can notify them. And you can tell them, because there's usually 2 to 3 weeks, you can tell them you can fix it up, you can cure it. So this notice and cure, which Oregon does all the time. Oregon actually does not require this security envelope. It's optional. Nonetheless, in Pennsylvania, the Republican Party said this is inappropriate, this notice and cure, that there was no reason why that had to be done. Why did the Secretary of State, a Democrat, tell counties they could do this? And they said, and some counties did it that were predominantly Democrat, and some counties didn't that were predominantly Republican, and this is a violation of equal protection law of the clause. These lawsuits have been repeatedly rejected But this whole notion that even when you vote, your vote might not count is a very serious issue. All right, so in my concluding remarks, I just want to say that this election, as controversial as it is very different than that of the 2000 election, which, and the results did go to a Supreme Court decision. Again, they did mention the equal protection. The problem with Florida, the state of Florida in 2000, was a lot of irregularities. There was this notorious butterfly ballot where unfortunately a lot of people were voting for the wrong person because it crossed on two sides of a tablet and it was misaligned. And so that was a real issue. Then there were these what are called hanging chads or dimpled chads. There were irregularities in terms of, again, the kind of rejection of ballots that came in where the voter intent, was the voter intent clear or was it not clear? And so there was a massive, it took many weeks to have recounts and recounts. And ultimately, because the recount was not done statewide, and could not be done statewide in time, that's why the decision went to declare George Bush the victor. Al Gore could have pressed more. He could have petitioned and taken the legal apparatus to the extent, and he decided not to do so. A very different atmosphere and a very different context and a very different man than what we're seeing in 2020. So I think without underscoring all the needs for improvement, I think I have been sort of very negative and very critical about what has happened, with the exception of voter turnout and vote by mail. There clearly are lots of things that need to be done. There have been many editorials in the United States about how there needs to be more systematic rules on when do you count votes? What do you do with naked ballots? What do you do with mail-in ballots that arrive late? There has to be some kind of, if not uniform standard, at least uniform guidance on how to run elections. So I look forward to all of your questions in next week, etc. So thank you very much.